The Bookshop Door. Chapter 1. The Old Shop. Clara Winter lived a quiet life in the city of York. She worked as a school librarian and spent most of her time surrounded by books. She liked silence, soft light, and the smell of old paper. Her days were simple. She helped children find stories, organized shelves, and wrote notes in her journal. She didn't talk much, but she listened carefully. She often felt safer in stories than in real life. One rainy afternoon in October, Clara walked through the older part of the city. She liked the narrow streets and the buildings with stone walls and crooked windows. She didn't plan to go anywhere special. She just wanted to walk and think. Her coat was damp, and her shoes made soft sounds on the wet pavement. As she turned a corner, she saw a small alley she had never noticed before. It was quiet and dark, with ivy growing along the walls. At the end of the alley stood a shop with a faded sign. The letters were hard to read, but she could still make out the word, books. The windows were dusty, and the door looked old. Clara felt curious. She stepped closer and pushed the door. Inside, the air was dry and warm. The shop was small but full of books. Shelves reached the ceiling, and piles of novels stood on the floor. There was no music, no sound, just the soft ticking of a clock. Everything was clean and carefully arranged. It didn't feel abandoned. It felt waiting. Clara walked slowly between the shelves. She touched the covers and read the titles. Some books were familiar, others strange. She felt calm, as if the shop understood her. At the back of the room, she saw something unusual, a wooden door built into the wall. It had no handle, no lock, and no sign. It looked old, with scratches and faded paint. She turned to see a man behind the counter. He was thin, with gray hair and quiet eyes. He didn't speak first. He just watched her. Clara asked about the door. The man said it only opened for those who chose their book. He didn't explain more. He didn't need to. Clara looked around again. Her eyes stopped on a small book with a blue cover. It was a novel about a lost princess. She didn't know why, but she felt drawn to it. She picked it up and held it close. The moment she did, the wooden door creaked and slowly opened. Clara stepped toward it. The room behind the door was dark, but not frightening. It felt deep, like a dream. She didn't hesitate. She walked through the doorway, and the door closed behind her. She vanished from the shop. The man behind the counter didn't move. He simply returned to his chair and opened a book. The shop was quiet again. The door remained closed, waiting for the next reader to choose their story. And so, Clara's journey began, not in the real world, but in the pages of a book that knew her better than she knew herself. Chapter 2. Inside the book. Clara opened her eyes and saw a sky that looked too blue to be real. The clouds moved slowly, like soft paint across a canvas. She was lying in a field of tall grass, surrounded by wildflowers that shimmered in the sunlight. The air smelled sweet, like honey and pine. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming. But the wind touched her face, and the ground beneath her felt solid and warm. She sat up and looked around. In the distance, she saw hills, forests, and a castle with silver towers. The castle looked like something from a fairy tale. It stood high above the land, quiet and still, as if it had been waiting for her. Clara felt confused. She didn't remember how she got there. The last thing she remembered was the bookshop and the wooden door. Soon, people arrived. They wore long robes and carried flags with golden symbols. They bowed to her and called her Princess Elira. They said she had returned after many years. Clara tried to explain that she was not a princess, but they didn't listen. They were too happy, too sure. They believed she was the one they had been waiting for. Clara followed them to the castle. Inside, the halls were wide and filled with light. Paintings on the walls showed scenes from a story she didn't know, but somehow they felt familiar. A girl in a blue dress. A forest of mirrors. A tower with no door. Each image made her heart beat faster, as if they were pieces of a forgotten dream. She was given a room with a large window and a bed covered in soft blankets. Servants brought her food and clothes. Everything was beautiful, but Clara felt like a stranger. She didn't know the rules of this world. She didn't know who she was supposed to be. Still, she stayed quiet and watched. She listened to the people around her. She tried to understand. As days passed, she noticed strange things. The people in the castle spoke in riddles. The garden changed shape each morning. The moon sometimes rose in the middle of the day. Nothing followed the logic of the real world. But Clara didn't feel afraid. She felt like the world was trying to tell her something. She began to explore the castle and the land beyond. In the forest, she met a woman who looked like her mother but spoke like a stranger. In the village, she saw a child who reminded her of herself at age 10, quiet, curious, always holding a book. In the mirror room, she saw not her reflection, but a version of herself who looked stronger, braver, and free. Clara started to understand. This world was not just a fantasy. It was a reflection of her mind. The people, the places, the strange events, they were all parts of her. Her fears became shadows in the woods. Her dreams became songs in the air. Her memories shaped the land around her. She realized that the book she had chosen was not random. It had chosen her. The story of the lost princess was her own story, told in a different way. She had always felt lost, unsure of her place in the world. She had hidden behind books, afraid to live her own life. Now, the story was asking her to step forward, to become the person she had always been inside. Clara didn't know how the story would end. But for the first time, she wanted to find out. She was no longer just reading a book. She was living it. And the only way forward was through the pages of her own truth. Chapter 3. Thomas's Journey. Thomas Edwards had not written a single word in over 5 years. Once, he had been a published author. His books had sold well, and readers had praised his imagination. But something inside him had faded. He no longer felt the spark that once pushed him to create. His days became quiet and slow. He worked part-time in a bookstore, avoided long conversations, and spent most evenings walking alone through the streets of York. One cold afternoon, Thomas wandered into a part of the city he didn't know well. He turned down a narrow alley and saw a small bookshop with a faded sign. The windows were dusty, and the door looked old. He felt drawn to it, though he didn't know why. He stepped inside. The shop was silent. Shelves were filled with books, some new, some ancient. The air smelled like paper and wood. At the back of the shop, Thomas saw a wooden door with no handle. It looked strange, almost out of place. He walked toward it, but nothing happened. Then he noticed a book on a nearby table. It had a dark green cover and gold letters. He picked it up and felt a shock of recognition. It was his own book, one he had written long ago, before he stopped believing in himself. He opened the first page and saw his name. The words felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. As he held the book, the wooden door creaked open. Without thinking, Thomas stepped through. He found himself in a world he had created years ago. The sky was deep purple, and the trees had silver leaves. The air was filled with soft music, and the ground sparkled with dust. It was beautiful, but it was not peaceful. His characters were there. The brave knight, the clever thief, the lonely queen. They looked at him with anger and sadness. They asked why he had left them. They said he had stopped telling their stories, and now they were lost. Thomas tried to speak, but his voice felt weak. He walked through the world, seeing places he had once imagined. Castles, forests, rivers, all shaped by his words. But now, they were fading. The colors were dull, and the air was heavy. The world was breaking apart, piece by piece. Thomas felt pain. He remembered the nights he had spent writing, the joy of building something new. He remembered the moment he gave up, the fear that his words were not good enough. He had stopped writing because he thought no one cared. But now, he saw that his stories had lived beyond him. They had meaning. They had life. He sat by a quiet lake and looked at his reflection. He saw a tired man, but also a man who had once dreamed. He realized that his inspiration had not died. It had only been waiting for him to return, to believe again. Thomas stood up and walked back through the world. He spoke to his characters, not with perfect words, but with honesty. He said he was sorry. He said he wanted to try again. The world began to change. The colors returned. The music grew louder. The sky opened. He walked toward the door, ready to leave. But he knew he was not the same. He had faced his doubts, his pain, and his fear of being forgotten. He had learned that stories do not disappear. They wait. And sometimes they call us back. Thomas stepped through the door and returned to the bookshop. The book was still in his hands. He looked at it and smiled. He was ready to write again. Not for fame, not for praise, but for truth. For connection. For the quiet magic that lives in every story. Chapter 4. Worlds Collide. Clara walked through a quiet forest filled with silver trees and soft blue light. The air was cool, and the ground sparkled with dust. She had been in this world for days, maybe weeks. Time felt different here. She had met strange people, seen places that reminded her of dreams, and faced moments that felt like memories. But nothing had prepared her for what happened next. As she reached a clearing, she saw someone standing near a broken fountain. He looked lost, like he didn't belong. His coat was worn, and his eyes were tired. It was Thomas Edwards. Clara didn't know his name yet, but she felt something familiar in him. He looked at her with quiet surprise, as if he had seen her before in a story. They didn't speak, but they understood. Something had changed. The world around them began to shift. The trees moved like pages turning. The sky flickered between colors. Clara's kingdom and Thomas's story were merging. The characters from both books appeared together, some confused, some angry, some silent. The brave knight from Thomas's book stood beside the Mirror Queen from Clara's world. They didn't know what to do. Clara and Thomas walked through the new landscape. It was a mix of castles, forests, rivers, and ruins. Each place held a piece of their past. Clara saw her childhood fears in the shadows. Thomas saw his lost words written in the sky. The world was not just fantasy anymore. It was a mirror. It showed them who they were and what they had hidden. They tried to leave. They searched for a door, a path, a way out. But the world didn't let them go easily. Every step forward required something real. Clara had to admit that she had always been afraid of change. She had lived through books, not through life. Thomas had to face the truth that he had stopped writing because he didn't believe in himself anymore. When they tried to run, the world cracked. The sky broke into pieces. The ground shook. The characters faded. The stories began to fall apart. It was not punishment. It was a warning. This place was built from truth. If they refused to face it, it could not hold them. So they stopped running. They sat by a quiet lake and listened to the wind. Clara spoke about her fear of being seen. Thomas shared his pain of feeling forgotten. They didn't fix everything in one moment, but they began to understand. The world around them calmed. The colors returned. The characters watched in silence. Clara and Thomas realized that the door in the bookshop was not just a way into fantasy. It was a way into themselves. It opened only when someone was ready to listen, to feel, to change. Their stories had merged because they both needed the same thing, to remember who they were and why they mattered. They stood together, not as strangers, but as two people who had walked through their own pages and found something true. The world didn't disappear. It waited. It held space for them to choose what came next. And they were ready. Chapter 5. The Test. The world around Clara and Thomas had grown quiet. The sky above them was still, and the land no longer shifted. It was as if the story itself was waiting. Waiting for them to choose. Waiting for them to face what they had hidden for so long. Clara stood near a stone bridge that crossed a river of glass. The water reflected not just her face, but her thoughts. She saw herself as a child, sitting alone in a school library, reading while other children played outside. She saw herself as a teenager, hiding behind books when life felt too loud. She saw herself now, still quiet, still dreaming, still afraid to speak her truth. She had always loved stories because they gave her a place to hide. In books, she could be brave without risk. She could feel without being seen. But now, the story was asking her to step out of the pages and into her own life. She had to admit that she was afraid to be herself. Afraid to be wrong. Afraid to be seen. Thomas walked through a field of broken statues. Each one looked like a character he had once created. Some were smiling. Some were crying. Some were turning to dust. He touched one and felt a sharp pain in his chest. These were not just characters. They were parts of him. Pieces of his voice, his heart, his hope. He had stopped writing because he thought no one cared. He believed his words had no power. But now he saw that his stories had lived on. They had shaped this world. They had touched Clara. They had touched him. He was not lost. His words were still alive, even when he had forgotten them. The world began to test them. Clara entered a hallway filled with doors. Each door had a title from a book she had once loved. She opened one and stepped into a scene where she was the main character. But the story did not go as she remembered. The people in the scene asked her questions she didn't want to answer. They asked who she really was. They asked what she wanted. She could not leave the room until she spoke the truth. Thomas faced a mountain path. At the top was a desk with a blank page. The wind pushed against him as he climbed. Voices from his past whispered in his ears, critics, teachers, even his own doubts. They told him he was not good enough. They told him to turn back. But he kept walking. When he reached the top, he sat at the desk and picked up the pen. His hand shook, but he wrote one sentence. Then another. The wind stopped. Each trial was not about fighting monsters or solving puzzles. It was about honesty. About facing the parts of themselves they had ignored. About choosing to move forward, even when it was hard. When they met again, they were different. Clara's eyes were steady. Thomas stood taller. They didn't need to speak. They had both passed their tests, not by being perfect, but by being real. The world around them began to glow. The path ahead became clear. The door back to the bookshop appeared in the distance, shining with soft light. It was time to return. But they knew now that the real journey was just beginning. They had found the way back, not through magic, but through truth. And that truth would stay with them, long after the story ended. Chapter 6. Return. Clara and Thomas stood together at the edge of the world they had just walked through. The sky above them was soft and golden, and the wind carried a quiet peace. They had faced their fears, spoken their truths, and passed the tests that the story had placed before them. Now, the path back to the bookshop had appeared, glowing gently like a memory ready to be remembered. They stepped forward, side by side, without rushing. Clara felt the ground beneath her feet, solid and calm. She no longer felt like a visitor in someone else's story. She felt present, awake, and real. Her thoughts were clear. She was not just a quiet librarian anymore. She was someone who had faced herself and chosen to grow. Thomas walked with a steady rhythm. His shoulders were relaxed, and his eyes were open. He had carried the weight of silence for years, believing his voice had no place. But now he knew that his words mattered, not because they were perfect, but because they were honest. He didn't need applause. He needed meaning. And he had found it. As they reached the doorway, the world behind them began to fade. The colors softened, the sounds grew quiet, and the light dimmed. It was not sad. It was gentle, like a book closing after the last page. They stepped through the door and found themselves back in the bookshop. The room was just as it had been before. Shelves full of books, soft light from the windows, and the quiet ticking of the old clock. But something had changed. Clara and Thomas were not the same people who had entered. Clara looked around and felt no fear. She didn't feel the need to hide behind stories anymore. She still loved books, but now she wanted to share her own voice. She wanted to speak, to teach, to help others find their own stories. She felt strong, not because she had become someone new, but because she had accepted who she was. Thomas walked to the counter and placed his hand on the book he had once written. He didn't feel regret. He felt ready. He would write again, not to impress, but to connect. He would write about truth, about change, about the quiet power of facing yourself. He didn't need to be famous. He needed to be honest. The shopkeeper stood behind the counter, watching them with calm eyes. He didn't say much. He simply nodded and smiled. Then he looked at the wooden door. It shimmered for a moment, then slowly vanished into the wall. There was no trace of it left. He said the door only appeared to those who were ready to listen to themselves. Clara and Thomas understood. The door had not been magic. It had been a mirror, a guide, a challenge. And now it had done its work. The shop was quiet again. No other customers came in. No other doors opened. But Clara and Thomas knew the truth. The journey had been real. The change had been real. And the story would stay with them, even as they walked back into the world. They left the shop together, stepping into the streets of York. The sky was gray, the air cool, and the city busy with life. But everything felt different. Not because the world had changed, but because they had. And that was enough. Chapter 7. Truth. Clara Winter returned to her quiet school library with a new sense of purpose. The shelves were still filled with books, the windows still let in soft morning light, and the children still whispered between the rows. But something inside Clara had changed. She no longer saw the library as a place to hide. She saw it as a place to begin. She started a writing club for the students. It was small at first, just a few curious children who liked stories. Clara didn't give them rules. She gave them space. She told them they could write anything they wanted. Some wrote about dragons and castles. Others wrote about their families, their fears, their dreams. Clara read every word with care. She didn't correct their grammar. She listened to their voices. As the weeks passed, more children joined. They came not just to write, but to be heard. Clara helped them shape their stories, but she never changed their truths. She believed that every child had something important to say. She saw how writing helped them understand themselves. She saw how stories could heal. Clara also began to write again. Not for herself, but for the students. She wrote short pieces about her own life, about being quiet, about feeling lost, about finding courage. She read them aloud during club meetings. The children listened closely. They saw that even adults had fears. They saw that honesty was not weakness. It was strength. Thomas Edwards sat in his small flat in York, looking at a blank page. But this time, he didn't feel pressure. He didn't feel fear. He simply began to write. His new book had no heroes, no battles, no magic spells. It had thoughts. Real thoughts. It had moments of doubt, memories of silence, and questions without answers. He wrote about walking through the city alone. He wrote about losing his voice and finding it again. He wrote about the bookshop door, not as a fantasy, but as a symbol. A door that opened only when someone was ready to face themselves. His words were quiet, but they were true. When the book was finished, he didn't send it to a big publisher. He gave it to a small local press. He didn't care about sales. He cared about meaning. The book reached readers slowly, like a whisper. But those who read it felt something deep. They saw parts of themselves in the pages. They felt less alone. Thomas visited Clara's writing club one afternoon. He sat with the children and listened to their stories. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. Clara smiled at him, and he smiled back. They both knew that the journey through the bookshop door had changed them, not with magic, but with truth. Their lives moved forward. Clara continued to teach. Thomas continued to write. They didn't become famous. They became real. And that was enough. They had learned that to change the world, you don't need power or fame. You need honesty. You need courage to face yourself. You need stories that come from the heart. And sometimes, the most powerful door is the one you open inside. Moral. True magic is honesty with yourself. Books can open doors, but you can only walk through them with an open heart. Thank you for your attention. If you like the story, please like and subscribe. It motivates us to make new videos and helps us promote the channel. Thank you.